And as I said, some things that President Kuchma, former President Kuchma, said recently seemed rather curious to me. His observations were that the Gangaza murder was actually the result of foreign intelligence services, that the CIA was deeply involved in the success of the so-called Orange Revolution in 2004, and that he, former President Kuchma, is very glad our President Obama's foreign policy priorities no longer include forcing democracy on countries around the world. What, if any, relevance do these views have and ramifications that might somehow affect European integration? Are they just the personal view of President Kuchma, or are there broader implications? Nadia?
You're expecting all of the answers from me. Maybe I'll start with the first two and kick the one about President Obama over to David, who's much more experienced in the affairs of government than I. Looking at the Gongadze affair, which actually has been in the news this week since it was the 10th anniversary, 16th of September 2000 was the day that Georgi Gongadze disappeared, and subsequently we've actually discovered, and it's been proved now conclusively, that he was actually murdered on that very evening when he was abducted. And if you remember, his decapitated head was found later, decapitated body was found later, and also the implication a couple of months later with the surfacing of some tapes that were made in the, purportedly made in the president's office, who was Kuchma at the time, with that the president and his top officials were somehow complicit. Well, it's taken us 10 years to get to this point, and I think both the Yushchenko governments and the Yanukovych governments, the current government, have a lot to respond to in terms of having this process so delayed. But that President Kuchma could still say after all of this time that he believes that somehow there were foreign intelligence services complicit, I don't know really what he could be referring to, other than possibly the involvement of the Russian FSB, which he probably would know a lot more about than has surfaced in the official documents. But this sort of signifies to me still a kind of conspiratorial mindset within Ukraine's political elite, of which President Kuchma still is a part, by the way. He's living very comfortably, making statements as we see. On the Orange Revolution, I think it's been conclusively shown that actually, again, Russia provided far more funding during that time than the United States ever did. There were Russian advisors. I seem to remember some kind of famous quote. I may be misquoting this, but Gleb Pavlovsky, who one of the top technological experts for how to manipulate and, well, how to work, let's put it this way, like how to work with elections in Moscow, complained that so much money had been put into Ukraine, but that in the end they had a lousy candidate to work with, and so that was the reason why it didn't all work. And I think there are many other people who've also commented on that. I just recently looked at the chapter on Ukraine that Lilia Shevtsova has included in her new book, and she as well, as a Russian political scientist, confirms that, yes, there was a lot more money coming from Russia. The funding that came from the United States was actually rather meager, actually, in comparison. The kinds of activities that it went to support were getting out the vote, the exit poll, which actually in the end proved to be crucial, election observation, spreading information about what was going on. All of these that in a normal society you would normally have funding and various institutions that would be taking care of this. So I don't know, maybe President Kuchma ought to get out a bit more. The question about foreign policy and President Obama, let me just kick that right over to David.
David?
Great, thanks. Maybe actually we'll just take this out, it might be easier. Well, Bob, first of all, thanks to you and Nadia for inviting me to be part of the dialogue, for organizing this chat here this morning, and always a pleasure to be with Nadia for any discussions on Ukraine, a country she knows far better than I ever will. She punted on the third question to me. Let me just say, in reinforcing her point about the revolution, that the estimates when I was in the government, U.S. government, were that Russia sunk in some $600 million in support of Yanukovych's campaign. Then President Putin went down twice, once before the election, then in between rounds to support him. There was massive Russian interference in that election, trying to tip the victory toward Yanukovych, and it failed, and it backfired. And I think the Russians learned from that, as we saw in the election held this year, where they took a much more low-key profile, and I'm sure sunk in some money, but nowhere near the amounts that we saw in 2004. The third point that you raised about President Kuchma's comments actually worry me more than the other two, because I worry that this is a perception held not just by President Kuchma, but by others in Ukraine too, that the United States is not doing enough to press on democracy and human rights. I think Secretary Clinton, in her visit in July, did touch on these points. I think she, from what I understand, did cover them in all of her private meetings, did mention them in her public events as well. But when she and others talk about President Yanukovych's commitment to democracy and human rights, I think we have to be careful not to take what he's saying for granted and look at what's happening on the ground. And I think if we do that, then the picture isn't very bright and promising. And here I think it probably means that the United States and European allies are going to have to speak out a little more forcefully and make sure that President Yanukovych follows through on his commitments, rhetorical commitments, and that those get translated into action, so that whether it's rectors at universities or heads of museums or whatever the case may be, they are not subject to SBU persecution, so that journalists don't disappear. I mean, how sad it is that, as Nadia was describing, the Gongadze anniversary, another journalist has disappeared. We still haven't found him yet. And so these kinds of episodes, and I guess we'll get into more of this as we get into our discussion here, pressure on the media, pressure on assembly, pressure on the opposition, a number of corners that have been cut to move forward on the political agenda that President Yanukovych and his government have, I think raise serious concerns and require the United States to speak out forcefully on these issues.